In 1998, around 1998, the Roundtable had been focusing a lot on trying to understand and learn more about community change efforts, how well they were working, how they could be made to work better. And we were getting, people in the community building field were saying to us, you know, we're working largely in communities of color, but we don't seem to be making the amount of progress that we feel that we want to move. We're not moving the dial in the way that we think that we should be. We think race may have something to do with it, but we don't really know how that's working. And we don't feel comfortable talking about race. And so we had a dialogue within our Roundtable members. And, you know, I always tell this story because for me, in some ways, it was a watershed moment, I think, for the Roundtable, where we had a panel discussion. We asked Ralph Smith and Angela Blackwell and I think it was Peter Edelman to talk about race from their perspectives and their work, and also sort of how they think about it. And one of the things that came up in the course of that dialogue was that Angela Blackwell said that when she gets together with her friends, the issue of race always comes up. And in the course of the dialogue, John Gardner, who was a member of our Roundtable before he passed away, said that he was really struck by Angela's comment because when he gets together with his friends, the issue of race rarely comes up. So you have an African-American woman talking about how she's always talking about race, and a white male talking about how he never talks about race. And at that point, the Roundtable said, you know, you really ought to spend some time thinking through this issue, helping develop some sort of a language and framework for people to develop a comfort level in talking about this. And so we, and that's partly what we did. Keith pulled together a lot of different sources of information to develop this framework that I'm going to walk you through. So if you have any hard questions about it, you should really ask Keith about it. You know, I tried to apply it to the youth development field because we do a lot of work with people in the youth development field around these issues. And we thought that one of the ways to help convey this information, to get leaders to focus on these issues, to get them to both feel comfortable talking about race among themselves, but also engaging other leaders in conversation about race, is to develop an Aspen Institute type seminar in which we bring together leaders who have influence over policies, over practices, over media representations, over resources, to come in a safe environment to learn about what we call structural racism, and to give them some tools that will help them when they go back to their communities and to their organizations to promote racial equity. And so what I'm going to talk to you about for the next couple of minutes is that framework. We usually spend about 4.5 to 5 days, anywhere from 3 to 5 days with leaders going through this framework, helping them understanding a lot of different kinds of exercises that we have people do with video, lots of different ways to get people to learn it, but really finding a way to help them understand and get comfortable talking about race and making a commitment to go back and engage others in this dialogue. So, you know, and people come with varying degrees of understanding of this. Most people really don't have a good sense of what structural racism is. They're not really doing racial equity work. So we start with just sort of laying out some statistics, which you guys probably more than most are familiar with, where you can look in just about any area and see that there are different outcomes by race. We see it in poverty, we see it in education, we see it in the justice system, we see it in employment, and so on. And really engage people in a conversation about why is it that race and racism are so difficult issues to grasp with, to deal with, and even to talk about. And we think there are a number of reasons why. One is that I think we're still struggling about what does race mean and what is equality. You know, we sort of talked about fairness. People have lots of different ways that they think about that. We also often fail to acknowledge the ways that race has really been a fundamental axis of social organization in the United States. It underlines many things, and I'm going to come back to this point in a little bit. We often, it's quicker, it's easier to address the symptoms rather than the roots of social problems, even if you can get people to agree on what the roots of social problems are, much less the solutions for them. And we're often reluctant to acknowledge the legacies of race. You know, we also, whenever we want to talk about sort of the historical context, people often say, you know, why are we talking about that stuff? We're here in the present now, and this other stuff really doesn't happen. We sort of moved beyond that. So there's a reluctance to that. And this goes back a lot, I think, to what Susan and Tiffany were talking about earlier, that these, this really resonates with our very deeply held beliefs about success and about failure, which is very much tied to our national values. And so we thought that it would be important then to provide some tools for leaders to get them to work on racial equity. We thought they needed a language to talk about race, a framework for understanding how race and ethnicity operate in this post-civil rights legislation era, and new ideas and strategies for reducing racial inequities in key opportunity domains and in promoting racial equity. And so if we start with what is race and how do we understand it, you know, we always want to start with the fact that it's a social construct, meaning that it was just invented by humans. It has no real biologic or scientific basis behind it. And in fact, there was an article in the Archives of Pediatrics and Adolescent Medicine where they were talking about the Genome Project, and they were saying that one of its greatest contributions is to point out the incredible biological similarity of us all, and they note that there is a greater range of genetic differences within such groups as white or black than between groups. And finally, that we think that it's best understood in social and in political tools, that it's really a yardstick for allocating power and for distributing society's material benefits and burdens. So when we talk about a new language, we thought it was important, again, is to really focus on not just the advantages associated with being a person of color, and that's what we refer to as structural racism. I'm going to get to more specific definitions in a minute, but also the ongoing advantages associated with being white, which is sometimes referred to as white privilege. And as we talk about it, we use Peggy McIntosh's definition, which most people are able to relate to, which is this invisible package of unearned assets that one can count on cashing in each day, but about which, as she says, I was meant to remain oblivious. And this knapsack, she gives this knapsack example, and she pulls out many different examples of white privilege. I just have a few things here, but the list is quite long. I'm sure you're probably familiar with that piece. And so I'm going to move on to the definition of structural racism that we use, is that it describes the complex ways that history, public policies, institutional practices, and cultural representations or stereotypes and norms interact to maintain racial hierarchy and inequitable racial group outcomes, which allows the privileges associated with whiteness and the disadvantages associated with color to endure and adapt, which is a huge mouthful, which who can remember this long definition? But what we do is sort of break that down. And so we start with really trying to think about, well, how is structural racism different from other forms of racism? There's individual level racism, institutional level racism. Those are some of the common explanations for disparities. And so everybody's pretty familiar with the individual or intergroup level things, which we think are important because these attitudes and these beliefs can color decision-making and action. And as we all know, in a lot of these systems, so many decisions that people make are discretionary decisions. And we can look at racial attitudes, and there have been some progress in some of these areas. You can see the light blue and the dark blue represent yes responses to these questions. In 1977, the light color, and the dark color for 2002. So you can see there has been some progress among individual racial attitudes, similarly with whether or not someone would vote for a black candidate for president. But we think that the bigger problem is racism at the institutional and at the structural levels. And so starting with institutional racism, we really are looking at the way in which policies and practices within institutions produce outcomes that chronically favor or disfavor certain racial groups. It can be intentional, it can be unintentional. We don't really focus on the intentionality, but rather on the outcomes. And we can see examples of institutional racism in many different ways, and discriminatory practices, redlining, and steering, and so on. You can see them in, for those of you who are in the education area, I'm sure you have many, many examples. We can look, for example, at the way in which teachers are assigned to schools, and see that in schools that have high minority concentration, they get math classes that are taught by out-of-field instructors, and there's a lot of research on the qualifications of teachers and how that influences the outcomes for kids. You can see this is an older chart, which I'm sure if we updated it now, we'd probably see similar kinds of findings in the employment area of who gets laid off during recessions relative to proportions in the population. And often people will talk about institutional racism from a systems perspective, looking at the ways in which these different systems are related to each other. So for example, we talk a lot about the school to prison pipeline and look at the way in which kids are getting suspended from school and arrested or referred to law enforcement or juvenile court and then prosecuted for behavior at school. We can look at other ways in which you can see this in the labor market and other areas where there's interaction between these systems. So when we think about structural racism, though, we contend that the individual level and institutional racism are only part of that social ecology, that it's not just sort of adding things up, as Susan mentioned, people have a tendency to do, but rather we like to focus on the racialized cultural and historical context in which institutions and individuals are unavoidably embedded. And it points out that there's a widely shared set of beliefs and stereotypes about race, which is revealed in our popular culture. We see it reflected in surveys of attitudes about different racial groups and so on. And we think that it's important to focus on structural racism because these causes are really hard to see. We're so embedded in them, and don't often take a step back and sort of try to focus on them. They're so woven into the fabric of our assumptions about how things operate, and they're self-perpetuating, so they don't actually require active work to be maintained. And in fact, in one of the seminars that we gave, I don't remember exactly who it was who said this, but one person said that it's so important to sort of step back and look at this because fish don't notice the water that they're swimming in. You have to sort of take a step back to analyze this and take a look at this before you even recognize what's going on here. We often, at the Roundtable, talk about the movie The Matrix. I don't know if anybody saw The Matrix. We've seen it about 100 times. But it's sort of like, we think of it as sort of there's this red pill and a blue pill, and I don't remember which is which, but for those of you who haven't seen it, there's this guy, and it's futuristic, and there's this world, this beautiful, nice little world that's so perfect, but that it's all a construction. And you take the red pill or the blue pill, and you are then able to see what's behind that system. And we think about structural racism as sort of in this matrix view that that it's important to get out of being embedded in it, take a step back, and take a look at what's going on behind the scene. And so what we think about this knowledge or this ideological context is really, really important. And the components of that are, in our view, historically accumulated white privilege, our national values, and our contemporary culture. Because we think that these beliefs, the knowledge, the assumptions, the way that we view and interpret the world around us, they can really inform the judgments that we make even when we're not consciously aware of them. And I'm just going to take a couple of minutes and just talk a little bit about each of these globes. So if we think about historically accumulated white privilege, basically what we think is important for people to understand is that the historical and contemporary advantages that whites have had in access to quality education, decent jobs, livable wages, and home ownership and such have really helped to create and sustain advantages. You can particularly see this in the wealth accumulation area. And these past policies and practices mean that today minority families have fewer resources, particularly thinking about people who care about youth development issues, to provide support for their children. And we can see this in the data about wealth disparities. There are huge gaps in net worth, median family net worth for whites and for people of color. And you can explain this in lots of different ways.